Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another North Sydney Conversations online event. We hope you're coping okay with lockdown, and we're delighted that you can join us tonight to discuss targets and innovation for a clean energy future. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet tonight. I'm on the land of the Cammeraygal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders joining us tonight. North Sydney Conversations is run by volunteers who want to give people in the North Sydney electorate the opportunity to be part of meaningful discussion about issues that matter, like integrity in government and climate change. We also want to help people connect with other like-minded locals. My name's Susie Bessel. You'll meet Treen Barter later in the evening, and our two other volunteers are Liz Tay and Johnny Kennedy. Before we get tonight's conversation underway, we're just letting you know that there will be time for questions. Thank you to those who shared a question when you signed up. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible. And if you think of a question during the conversation, please post them in the chat as we go. For those who aren't familiar with the setup, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a message icon. And if you click on that, that will open the chat panel. Also, feel free to share comments in the chat as we go along. At the conclusion of the conversation, there'll be an opportunity to stay on for what we call chat roulette, where we'll allocate people randomly into breakout rooms of 4 to continue the conversation. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest tonight. Zali Steggall is the federal member for Warringah and recipient of an Order of Australia medal. She's the successful barrister and Olympic medalist who won the seat of Warringah from Tony Abbott in 2019. One of her policy platforms was stronger climate action, and she introduced her climate change bills to Parliament last year, and they provide a sensible plan for Australia to reach net zero emissions. After a parliamentary inquiry early this year, the Environment and Energy Committee released its report into the bills in July, unfortunately recommending against the bills being passed and also against them being debated in Parliament. Heidi Lee is the CEO of Beyond Zero Emissions, an independent solutions-focused think tank. She led their much-lauded COVID-19 response strategy, the Million Jobs Plan, which outlines how in just 5 years, renewables and low emissions projects can deliver more than 1.8 million jobs in regions and communities. And our MC tonight is Giles Gunesekera, founder and CEO of Global Impact Initiative. Giles has a unique blend of leadership and business skills from the corporate world and finance and governance skills from the not-for-profit sector. At the Global Impact Initiative, he's focused on bringing purpose to capital to create impact investments that have the dual purpose of generating positive financial returns and measurable intentional social impact. Over to you, Giles.
Great, thank you, Susie, and welcome everyone for this very, in what will be a very enlightening, exciting discussion this evening, and no doubt robust as well. I want to acknowledge that I'm on Wali Mudigal land here in Sydney and pay my respects to ancestors past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge our First Nations people continuing connection to land, waters and culture of this great country, and that sovereignty of the land was never ceded. So thank you for joining for this great discussion around climate. I'm going to kick straight into it now that we've done the introductions for both Heidi and Zali. But if I can address the first question to Zali, Albert Einstein once said that the world is not dangerous because of those that do harm, but because of those who look at it without doing anything. And Zali, you certainly can't be accused of not doing anything. My first question to you is, why are the climate change bills that you tabled in Parliament so important for Australia?
Well, thank you, Giles, and hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to come and talk about the climate bills. And I would also like to pay my respects to Indigenous elders, past, present and emerging, because we certainly do all have a duty to take better care of the land on which we live, and that the legacy will pass on to our future generations. And that is why the bills are so important. the climate policy in Australia has been incredibly divisive for way too long, over 10 years. And it was very much, obviously, what I promised to come to Parliament. The platform that I took to Warringah was very much about trying to break the very divisive politics we've had around climate policy and bring forward a sensible plan. The climate change bills are modelled on legislation that was passed in the UK in 2008, so 13 years ago, and has proved to be incredibly effective to provide stability and policy certainty for the UK in their transition. It's got some very key pillars that are really important and that are strongly supported in Australia by pretty much all sectors, because it locks into law an ultimate goal of net zero by 2050, but it also locks into law the framework of how to get there, which is with 5-year emission reduction budgets that can be ratcheted up as needed and as the science dictates. But importantly, it also ensures that we're doing so with a climate change commission, which is expert-based and independent. And that has been a key success in the UK, in fact, in driving policy advice. But also in Australia, I think we all recognise risk assessment and adaptation planning really needs to be on the forefront of our response to climate change and global warming. And at the moment, we are not properly addressing that risk. So I would argue there are many, many reasons why we need the climate change bills to pass. And look, they have overwhelming support from every sector of Australian society and private sector and business.
Great, thank you, Zali. Heidi, in the introduction, Susie mentioned your role at Beyond Zero Emissions. If you could just go into a little bit more detail as to the role that Beyond Zero Emissions, BZE, plays in the clean energy sector.
Thanks so much, Giles, and thanks again for having me here tonight. It's really exciting to join so many people interested in having this conversation. I'm really glad that we're presenting it as a conversation as well. I'm joining you tonight from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne. Different lockdown, guys. But the primary work that we're doing at BZE at the moment is on the lands in central Queensland on the coast near where I grew up, which I actually grew up on the Durumba land near Rockhampton, and in the Hunter Valley in New South Wales, closer to your home for many of you. So Beyond Zero Emissions is a think tank. We use our research as a bit of a Trojan horse to make action on climate happen bigger, faster and fairer. The work that we've done over the last 10 years has looked at a decarbonisation pathway for every sector of the economy to get from where it is at the time when we wrote the report, from there down to zero emissions in 10 years using only commercially available technology. And I think that's a really key parameter for the work that we do and why our research really resonates with businesses, with communities, and with governments interested in actually making change happen on the ground, because we are looking at how to deploy commercially available technology at scale and speed to achieve emissions reduction. When we think about doing that, though, the work of BZE started with this, the technical pathways, the how to get every building in the country ready for a zero emissions grid, how to decarbonise our transport sector, our stationary energy and all the rest. But then not every part of Australia, not every Australian is going to experience the transition to zero emissions the same way. That'll depend on where we work, where we live, what our skills and experiences are, our financial situation, so many other parts of our individual experience of the world will impact how we experience the transition to zero emissions. So from 2012, we've also been writing plans that draw together the technologies that we've identified in our sector decarbonisation plans, drawing those technologies together and applying them in a regional context to show how decarbonisation would be experienced on the ground in locations around Australia where large numbers of people are going to be quite impacted by this. So one of the ones that we've done more recently in 2019, we looked at the Northern Territory, said what happens if instead of putting gas at the heart of their economic plan, they put renewable energy. And that, of course, shows enormous benefits. We can go into some of those details later. But the role of Beyond Zero Emissions in these conversations is really to identify those technology pieces, make sure that they're all commercially available today, and then work in partnership with local stakeholders who can actually help make a difference on the ground and see those great ideas that our researchers come up with deployed in practice to make a difference.
Fantastic. Thanks, Heidi. Zali, how do you feel climate change policy translates into economic benefits and opportunities for Australia?
Oh, look, it's huge, and it's probably the most frustrating aspect of the lack of policy we have in Australia. This transition is happening around the world to clean technologies, to net zero. The bulk of the world economies is now committed to net zero. And so what we have, and with the real prospect we face, is being left behind, because as all our trading partners and other countries transition, they become much more attractive jurisdictions for large amounts of investment than what Australia is, because there is too much uncertainty in Australia from that point of view. And we have a government that is focused on other technologies. There really is a laggard approach and looking at gas, for example. So in terms of the impact, I mean, there is huge opportunity in the transition. I mean, I think the work that Heidi's talking about, but also a number of other players in the sector in Australia around, we absolutely could be a clean energy superpower because we have so much natural resources from space, ultimately, with wind and solar, days of sunshine compared to other nations. We really have incredible capacity, and we're simply not embracing it yet. And the government is essentially putting barriers up, by failing to really progress things like the investment in our transmission lines. You're really putting barriers to embracing all of our potential. And that's incredibly frustrating. And for many, if it's not an environmental imperative that they want to see a much clearer policy around our transition to net zero, it's actually for the economic opportunity that will come with the new technologies and new industries that can be developed. We're already seeing, for example, the EU passing motions in relation to introducing border carbon tariffs on exports. Obviously there was news around the trade agreement with the UK, but we know that the UK and the US are strongly looking at what Australia's climate policy is. So we will pay a price. There is a carbon market around the world, but the way it's working at the moment is the benefit of it will be collected by other nations, and we will miss out.
Yeah, it's great, Zali. I recall a couple of years ago, I presented at a conference in Berlin, and I was talking about some of the work that we were doing around climate. And I remember a number of Nordic Dutch pension funds giving me their card. I remember one of the chief investment officer of a Danish fund giving me his card, and he said, "Giles, in Australia, you have sun and you have land. Let me know when you want me to invest. We'll be there." And that's very much continued. There's obviously lots and lots of international interest in Australia from an investment perspective. And obviously, when we talk climate, we're talking about a whole range of technologies, but ultimately economic benefits. So solar, wind, battery, climate technology, within climate technology, carbon capture, vertical farming, and we haven't even touched on the ocean. There's a whole bunch of really interesting ocean climate related investing as well. But if I could also address the same question to you, Heidi, and if you could also provide some additional examples of some of the great work that you're doing at BZE. How does climate change policy translate into economic benefits and opportunities for Australia?
Well, exactly right. You've done your research there, Giles. Like, we've just been releasing some really exciting work that's looked at exactly this question. So it's a combination of the narrative that we're drawing on with BZE's work, that the transition will not be equally felt by every person in Australia. It will be felt more acutely in some places more than others. So we've taken that opportunity to look, to zoom in on Gladstone, on central Queensland, and on Newcastle, on the Hunter Valley, and really look at those two locations as prime opportunities for many different reasons, for taking a precinct-based approach to transitioning our factories, our manufacturing sector, from gas and fossil fuels onto all electric technologies inside the factory, and then to power those factories with renewable energy. Pretty simple concept. Does need a fair bit of infrastructure upgrades to be able to make that happen, both inside factories, but also in the effective distribution of energy, sharing energy between factories, even like using heat networks to share like really high temperature hot air and hot water between factories to make sure that this is happening really efficiently and really effectively. Hydrogen, green hydrogen, can play a role in that factory network as well, in those precinct approaches. So there's a lot of infrastructure that can go into this concept, but it's a really foundational way that we can look after our manufacturing sector, that we can make really good use of the existing skill base in fossil fuel regions. There's a great skill translation between manufacturing and existing jobs that are at risk with a fossil fuel or transition away from fossil fuels. So there's a lot of really important reasons why we would choose particular locations around Australia to really dive in and see what the benefits would be. So we looked at our renewable energy industrial precinct concept. We have staff on the ground in the Hunter and someone working in central Queensland as well. And those staff have engaged local manufacturers and business stakeholders in those areas to get their support, basically work with them and figure out what the precinct would need to look like to have their support, and sign them up to take part in co-designing what this renewable energy industrial precinct would look like. Through signing up about 36 businesses in the Hunter. I'll talk about the Hunter since that's closer to home. I know everything's on Zoom these days, but let's pretend it's closer to your home. And the Hunter Valley there are so many incredible new businesses that we chose just 5 sectors that those businesses represented, and we ran an economic model that looked at what would the local uplift to the economy look like if we were to invest and to make this renewable energy industrial precinct happen. And it's, of course, it's fantastically good news for the Hunter and for Gladstone. So we ran the model on both places based on real world input. So real businesses scaling up with the provision of affordable and reliable renewable energy to their manufacturing sector. Combined, we could see 45,000 new jobs coming online in those 2 locations, heavily balanced towards the Hunter. About 11,000 in Gladstone and the remaining in the Hunter. So it's a big opportunity for the Hunter region. This would look like $13 billion in annual revenue going into these 2 locations alone. And these are not by far, these are just the 2 of like a lot of opportunities all around Australia. Within these locations, though, we'd also see new capital investment going into those locations, which is great for businesses and great for jobs, great for construction side of jobs. Around 36 billion across those 2 locations. They're huge numbers. That's looking at a 10-year program for transitioning existing businesses and scaling up and bringing online new complementary businesses. But those numbers are only based on those top 5 industries, right? So this is a tip of the iceberg kind of look at what you could do if you wanted to. And I think that's where we feed into the conversation around supporting policy and around the investment framework that we need to have to make sure that these opportunities are ones that we can act on. Because like Zali says, we look at these economic models as markets that we can seize if we move fast. But we are not the only ones moving quickly towards this opportunity. Other countries around the world are well positioned to move just as fast as we do. If we choose not to move, that is also a choice, and one that we need to consider very carefully. The uplift is enormous, but the cost of losing out means making some very big changes to the way of life and the way that we run our economy here in Australia.
Giles, if I could add, I mean, that's all correct.
Yeah, please.
The additional point that I think everyone needs to be aware of is the risk, currently the private sector is going through a process of very aggressive risk assessment around what does 1.5 degrees of warming by 2030 look like, what impact that has on their business model, and the projected 3.5 degrees of warming by 2050. So with the release of the recent IPCC report, what the private sector is doing very quickly, promptly, aggressively, is looking at what are the consequences of the current trajectory we're on to their business model. Because this is not a zero-sum game, as many politicians would sort of like to say to people, that somehow we can continue on. And, you know, when there's all these questions from someone like Barnaby Joyce about, you know, but what's on the menu and what's it going to cost? The reality is this is not a zero-sum game, and the private sector is incredibly aware of that and working very aggressively towards transitioning to net zero. And that's why so much in the private sector has moved towards making those commitments and are transitioning and making those real changes, and why there is so much pressure from the private sector that they need leadership from the government. The government needs to lock in that commitment, but put in the framework, but also put in a strong interim target. If we don't put on a clear interim target by 2030 for COP26, and that means at least a 50% reduction of emissions on 2005 levels by 2030, the private sector knows the level of risk they are exposed to. So we need to put a dollar value on that as well in our assessment of economic opportunity.
Yeah, really, really well said. The CEO of Standard Life, a very large insurance company, Amalo Vani, recently said, risk is the tariff paid to leave the shores of predictable misery. You know, this discussion around risk is just, you know, increasingly becoming more and more important. But yeah, really, we'll dive in a little bit deeper into risk, I guess, particularly of not acting. But to pick up some of your additional points, both Zali and Heidi, you know, you mentioned the private sector, the business sector, industry, really leading the way and looking for assets, looking for ways to change. You know, there's lots and lots of examples, both in Australia and globally. And I know in some of the work that that we do at Global Impact Initiative, you know, some of the conversations that graduates are having on the way into their jobs is not how is my bonus calculated and when is it paid? It is more around what's your recycling policy, what's your renewable energy policy, how many annual leave days do I get a year for volunteering? So all these issues are already there. All these questions are already being asked. Business, private sector seems to be leading the way, but also really interestingly, state governments around Australia are really forward-looking, and not only forward-looking, actually acting quite quickly. You've got the Tasmanian government, you know, that has a target of 120% renewables. You've got South Australia, you know, with their massive batteries and battery storage facilities. So the question really is, and it may be a little bit loaded going to a federal politician, but do we actually need a federal policy when change is already happening? So I'll let you answer that first, Zali.
Look, that question was debated at many times during the inquiry, obviously. And overwhelmingly, the response was yes. Overwhelmingly from the Business Council of Australia, Australian Industry Group, unions, pretty much all sector, ironically, except for, I would say, the fossil fuel industry. Yes, legislating our commitment and making it very clear. So the benefit of the climate bills is the fact that at any one time we have 2 5-year budgets in play. And what that does, those 5-year budgets, the minister of the day, and this is completely still up to the government of the day to respond to the recommendations of the Commission and implement a plan to address those budgets, has to identify the technologies, the ways in which the goals will be achieved over those 2 5-year plans, which means the private sector gets visibility. You've got to appreciate, and I'm sure many people here are business people. In business world, you do not make decisions that are just for the next 3 years. If you're making major capex investment, major infrastructure investment as to the direction of your company, you are looking at a 10 to 15 year horizon. You're looking at major investment. Even if we look at sectors like construction, because when we build properties, when you build infrastructure, you are building for 20, 30-year periods. So we need policy that actually provides long-term certainty, and that's what the bills do. And they provide those budget periods which allow the private sector to know where to invest. We looked at, for example, in the UK, where they've been able to develop great manufacturing of electric vehicles because, because the government has committed to net zero by 2050, identified how much of their emissions comes from their transport sector, how are they going to address reducing the emissions in that sector. That what gave the policy certainty and the imperative for the development of domestic electric vehicle manufacturing. Now, Australia doesn't have a car manufacturing industry to protect, but the reality is we could be leading the way in so many industries if we could provide that policy certainty. And instead, what we have is the government is repeatedly interfering in the market. So we have the market clearly saying we want to go to clean energy and renewables. The deflationary cost, the drop in price is incredible. It's catching nearly everyone by surprise. And instead of embracing that, the government is saying, well, actually, we want to invest in more gas, which the Australian Energy Market Operator, the integrated system plans all indicate we don't need any more gas. Gas is not price effective, it is expensive energy. Or looking at mechanisms to keep coal in the system even longer by supporting it with public money, because it is not commercially viable either. So it is really important to have policy certainty, and you need that from the top. We have state governments doing a great job. All our state government and territory government of both Labor and coalition, so this should be able to be bipartisan, have committed to net zero by 2050 and are implementing plans to give that effect. You know, I certainly don't agree with all the decisions that all state governments are doing, but on the whole, they are so far further ahead than what the federal government is at. So the federal government is the handbrake at the moment on our progression towards net zero.
And do they continue to be the handbrake, or do they have to catch up?
Oh no, they are holding on to that handbrake as tight as they can. That's the problem. Look, we're 5 weeks away from COP26, where all signatories of the Paris Agreement are expected to turn up with a renewed commitment. Excuse me, and a commitment, you know, a vastly increased ambition. Countries like the US and the UK have got over 50% ambition by 2030. The UK are up to 68% emission reduction. So we are miles behind at, you know, we are still on the 26 to 28%, which ironically, the only increase in our emissions reduction has been as a result of COVID and lockdowns, because we simply haven't had the emissions from the transport sector that we would normally have had. So that's hardly a result of good policy. That's just a result of, you know, an appalling situation with the lockdown. So no, unfortunately, the government, look, we've heard the Prime Minister, he will talk about, you know, preferably by 2050, as soon as possible, crab walking his way to it. But it's not a genuine commitment, because it's not matched with a strong interim target. You need a strong interim target by 2030 to actually deliver net zero by 2050. And the government is entirely silent on that. And if you look at the direction of funding, we are still funding fossil fuels at a rate of 80-1 compared to renewables. So I think everyone needs to know your funds, public money, is still overwhelmingly funding fossil fuels through a number of agencies, you know, whether it's the Export Finance Australia body, whether it's Northern Territory Infrastructure Funds. There's been a lot of attempts to sort of muddy the water around funding from the CFC and ARENA. So no, the government is not genuinely committed to a transition, because if it was, we would be doing things very differently.
Yeah, well, I think it's all agreed that our Prime Minister is probably the only leader of any organisation in the world that doesn't like setting targets for anything. So, but that's a whole different conversation. Heidi, Zali is not your local member, so you're quite you're allowed to disagree. or you're allowed to agree, do we need federal policy around climate change and around climate investments?
Look, only to back in, I think the sentiment I've heard, the only game in town is scale and speed. That does not happen without coordination and alignment from top to bottom in our government processes and our policy setting. It does not happen without a mass coordinated effort. Net zero by 2050 is not a worthwhile goal. That will not actually make the kind of difference that we need to see in our climate and in our health and our prosperity. That is a stepping stone. That commitment that we're working so hard to get to is just a stepping stone. That is the very first piece that we need to see come into place so that we can amplify and ratchet up that goal and get there even faster. We need to be working really closely with our eye on the carbon budget as our very first and foremost concern here. When we look at reducing emissions, we talk about front-loading emissions reduction. It is one of the reasons why our work at Beyond Zero Emissions, it is meant to sit here within the enormous efforts of lots of other groups and lots of other organisations around Australia and around the world who are all moving markets and moving industries towards these collective commitments and something they can all agree to. But those commitments will not be the leading edge. What we exist to do is to show just how hard and how fast you really can go if you want to, so that we can highlight real wins, like real examples of moving at the scale and speed that we must move to make a difference in the world. So it's yes, and yes, we need a federal policy. We need a whole lot of stars aligning, and we also need to raise the ambition of the enormous collaborations that are happening that are still not yet big enough. It's like everything we're already doing needs to be even bigger and even better and even faster. We're not going to get there with a divisive approach to this either. We need to be finding common ground with everyone that we can, no matter their persuasion, and make sure that this is something that we achieve together. Because when we are looking for that common ground and building on that common ground, every step we take forward and move in the right direction doesn't get stepped back when politics change or when other things move, right? So we are really looking for these agreeable things that we can get on and do that show that the magnitude of ambition that is entirely realistic to have. And it's the work that we're doing as well. I get every day to like meet people who are already on the ground making these incredible shifts happen in their business and in their community. So I get a lot of opportunity to be really inspired by that. And yeah, please do check out the social media stuff that we do if you want to share some of that excitement and optimism about the future. We do need a federal policy environment that is aligned with a ambition for a net zero, but this needs to actually be one that rewards, that sets this up as a race. It doesn't set it up as set a target, set and forget one target. This is a race to get to zero emissions, and it is a global race, one that we all have everything's at stake in this one, and we can do it.
And obviously, Heidi, the federal government's preference as a transition is gas. What's your preference? What would you like to see? There's no doubt we need to cut out coal. We transition from coal into. Sorry, that was for you, Heidi.
Okay, sorry. There was a couple of bits breaking up there, but there was some point in the question was, do I prefer gas? Absolutely not.
Sorry, what's the transition?
What's the transition
from coal if it's not gas?
Right. The transition here is only about how quickly we can bring on new renewable energy and strong grid support services. That is, supporting our electricity grid means everything from actually putting in things we've heard of like batteries and hydro dams and that kind of stuff, but also just demand management. It's one of the things that we really dived into when we looked at our precinct approach to factories and manufacturing, because it's very, very high energy demand. It is steelworks, it is smelters, it is the highest like concentration of energy demand that we have in our network service providers, right? So when we looked at how those precincts could help support a transition, we're looking at electrifying at scale and speed, and we're looking at making sure that we can, within those precincts, start to balance the amount of energy that they are using there so that the main electricity grid can provide more reliable services to homes, and schools and hospitals and the rest of the services that we need in addition to those manufacturers. So it's a balancing act there as well. This is why we do not need any more gas. No, everyone agrees. Almost everyone agrees. There is absolutely no technical reason for any more gas, any more fossil fuels, or any more investment in any of old technologies. We only need to invest in new ones. And primarily when it comes to public dollars, the role that we see for public investment is in helping our markets and our plans for transitioning large transitions, large energy users and large energy providers to all renewables. We need to work on this overcoming the chicken and the egg, the supply and the demand. We know that there's a lot of private capital and private investment that really wants to invest in generation, wants to invest in green hydrogen and making electrolyzers and all sorts of awesome things, big batteries, all the stuff we need. And we know that we've got these demand side things where we want to make sure that the steelworks and the smelters, they need to know that they've got reliable energy before they make the switch. What public investment can do is help to overcome the chicken and the egg there. Like, is there enough demand? Is there enough supply? And you end up in a bit of a standoff with an awful lot of private market capital and support wanting to get into both spaces, but without the policy certainty, not being able to do that. That is where we see the opportunity for government to be able to shape and help that planning and help that coordination piece happen, both with finance and policy support. We do not need to invest another dollar in fossil fuels.
Mm-hmm. Zali, did you want to add anything to that?
Oh, I absolutely agree. Look, and I have to say to everyone, obviously I'm not an expert in this. As a barrister, for me, my job was to put forward the most sensible argument, but it was also to get the access to the expert opinions and the expert advice to make it a sound, fact-based position. And for me, that's very much how I've seen my job as a politician, is to bring that forward. And it is incredible the amount of expertise we have in Australia, trying desperately to shout just how much there is a better plan than the one the government is putting up. We have so much opportunity. We are also incredibly exposed to risk. So we need to actually act upon this. And there are very specific triggers that could be done. And that's where it is incredibly frustrating that there is just a lack of political will at the moment in government. It is held to ransom. If I could give my political, observations of now nearly, 2.5 years down in Canberra, a lot of people talk about being concerned about climate change, about being committed to transitioning to a net zero economy, but they don't act in that way in Canberra. The reality is, at every turn, when there are choices in, fork in the road, where you can either be true to that Paris Agreement, true to an overwhelming need to reduce emissions, and so those choices come along, or do you go down the road of continuing on this dependence on fossil fuels and funding of fossil fuels? Time and time again, that is what happens. And so that is incredibly frustrating. And I feel incredibly at odds with what the Australian people actually want. And I think that is why conversations like tonight are incredibly important, because we need to pull back the curtain on the decisions that are being made in Canberra, because they are impacting our future, our kids' future, in a horrendous way.
We had an earlier question from John from Willoughby, and also through the chat, I think it was from Murray, around misinformation, particularly from certain networks and sources, News Corp and others. How do we get around that, Zali?
Look, we live in an era of incredible access to information, but just as we have access to information, there is incredible misinformation. So that's very true. I think it's really important to have the conversations, look for credible sources, look for peer-reviewed, and look for, comparisons internationally as well on how we're tracking. if I could say, don't just believe the government spin. The announcements from the government are always towards justifying the status quo. That it is never towards justifying our transition. It is always to maintain the status quo. And the status quo is not good enough. The status quo has us on track for 3.5 degrees of global warming. So with respect, it should not even, it just cannot be an option. We need to transition quickly, and we need to deal with that. I mean, I think everyone's really experienced misinformation around COVID as well. You know, we're really seeing it at play, and we have to really, I think there's a duty on every person to ensure you are properly informed. Australia has an incredible democracy. We have a compulsory voting system, but with that incredible privilege of voting comes responsibility to do so with knowledge of the issues and the impacts the choices we make will have.
Yep, great. There was also an earlier question from Janet, which I'll pose to Heidi, and also replicated through the chat. Is it too late? And also, is 2050 net zero one achievable, but is it also too late for that as well? So maybe just around the question of lateness would be great, Heidi.
Well, I think I would start with saying, like, we're not too late, but also I think that this is part of the idea of it's too late. Like, too late for what? Too late to try? Like, this is the number one thing I would love for this group to go away with. It is not too late to try. We are not done yet. And there are too many opportunities for us right now to actually act. I think we're going to get to a point in tonight where we get to rattle off our top recommendations for how you right now can make a difference and support the transition that needs to happen. It is technically possible for us to put in place the things that we need to do to avoid catastrophic, really deeply catastrophic global warming. But we need to put everything that we've got into this right now. This is not just about decarbonising and getting to 100% renewable. This is about doing mass drawdown. This is about really like reforestation and biodiversity. Like, there's a whole lot of things that I'm absolutely not an expert in. I read the research. This is an enormous challenge, and it is comparable to things that we have done as civilization in the past. We can do this. We just have to want to. And we have to work with everyone we can to make it happen. I loved the question about misinformation and how to combat that. And I think I'd like to remind, like, this is kind of the premise of having the conversation that we're having tonight, is that we get information from people we know and trust. And the credible messenger is incredibly important. And that's the thing that kind of that stays home for each of us, right? Like, you meet someone and they're incredible, they know what they're doing, they're incredibly smart, and they say something sensible, and you're like, that's it, they've changed my mind, I believe them. So one of the ways that Beyond Zero Emissions work with that is through working with people in regional communities who are already making this transition happen in their businesses and in their communities, capturing their stories and sharing those stories in local media. So a lot of the time we put our attention, I think, especially living in cities, as I do, as we do, most of us, we put our attention on national media and we look at these headline stories. And that's super important. That does shift public opinion. But you know what? When you get told by someone that you recognise from your local business community that they have already transitioned, that they're already powering their factory with solar panels, that they're shifting their business from they've serviced the mines, and they've been, moved from running diesel equipment to running everything on batteries and doing all electric mining equipment. Those stories make the transition tangible and real, and they make things possible that otherwise wouldn't have happened. And I think that kind of belief and that kind of lens on things, it overcomes the misinformation thing, but also encourages us to act and helps us see our place in this transition as well, which is important, not just for overcoming the naysaying, but most importantly, to make sure that even though the chances of absolute success are slim, that we put everything we can into this. And I did grab the link before, so I'll just press go on the chat and show you that story in action when you're not in the conversation. Look at that one tomorrow.
Thanks, Heidi. And just quickly on that, there's another really good question related to your answer from Erna, talking about the grid. Is our grid aligned to taking diverse sources of energy? So we've spoken obviously a lot about renewables and the different types of renewables. Can our grid cope?
Not today, absolutely not. But think of this as an investment opportunity. I think within energy circles, it is really well known we have underinvested in our energy transmission network for decades. We have a huge task ahead of us to be able to make this fit for purpose. But some of what we need to do is a redesign exercise. And I'm not just saying that because I used to be an architect before I came to this role, but this really is a design problem. We need to rethink the way that we're not just building that physical infrastructure and setting up the poles, the wires, the generation, the storage, but we also need to think about this from a usage point of view and look at how we're setting up our demand side of things, and then build an energy market that incentivizes effective management of that. So there's a lot of rework to do there, a lot of design work to do in the grid, but it can be done, and there are credible plans out there for how to make this work for Australia.
Great. Zali, we're getting close to the end of questions or time for questions, but it would be remiss to not mention Trent Zimmerman's comments in the Parliamentary Committee report into the bills when he said he couldn't support them because they limit the normal capacity of the elected government of the day to develop and determine policy on how Australia can best reduce its emissions. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, it was disappointing, but unfortunately not surprising. He towed the party line with that. It's actually completely debunked. It's rubbish. And I've addressed that in the dissenting report to the inquiry. It's actually quite the opposite. So the structure in the climate change bills is that it established a climate change commission. And the reason why we need that is think the Reserve Bank, think where we have a clear, independent, expert-based advisory body that provides the advice as to the best direction to achieve the necessary goal. And again, I think what Trent ignores with those comments is we are signed up to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is a commitment to limiting global warming to as close to 1.5 degrees as possible. What all international expert reports tell us, that requires a rapid transition and a no later than 2050 net zero, right? So that is the line in the sand. I strongly support that we get there sooner, but we at the very least need to put the line in the sand that we cannot go past that date, because that will create the drive and imperative that will drive investment to get there. You know, technology needs a target to drive uptake and investment. It just doesn't do it in a vacuum. So when Trent talks about that this is usurping the role of government, of elected officials, it simply isn't. What the climate bills do is they do impose a duty on the government to act equitably, to follow science, to follow fiscally responsible policies, to ensure we have generational equity in how we address the challenge of climate change. But it is entirely up to the government of the day to respond to the advice and determine what emission budget it will choose to set and what plans it will put in place to address that budget. If it chooses to depart from the advice of the experts, it simply has to explain why and give a reason. And it will then be up to the voters, when they judge a government every 3 years, on whether or not that was a valid departure from the expert advice. The irony is we got briefings from the UK's Climate Change Commission, and the way they see this, they're quite bemused by this approach from Trent and the coalition members, because in the UK, under a Conservative government, the Climate Change Commission advice is very much viewed as an insurance policy to government. Because essentially, just as what we keep seeing with COVID, you know, every time the government's made a decision, it's on the health advice. So you can't blame the government for the decision. It's the health advice that has driven that decision. What the UK government has been able to do is every time they are setting a budget, indicating technologies, indicating that where their transition is happening next, they've been able to say it's on the advice of the Commission. It is on the best expert advice of how we deliver our transition. And when there's been political fighting over, for example, an aspect of their transition, or initially it was around their net zero goal, it was able to be resolved by the Commission because the advice was there. So it's a completely back to front position. But I think where you have, I don't know if anyone was following the climate change inquiry, we had a day of public evidence where Dr. Penny Sackett gave evidence, and she's one of our previous chief scientists. And one of Trent's questions to her was, but really, if there's no political will for a certain lever or certain mechanism to transition, shouldn't it be that the Commission and the experts should not give advice in respect to that mechanism if there's no political will to deliver it? Essentially, if we tell you we don't want to know about this, don't tell us about it because we don't want it on the record, which is just a ludicrous approach to getting independent, expert advice on such a big problem. Dr. Penny Sackett's advice was incredibly to the point, which was we need to pull every lever available to us to get to a net zero as quickly as we can. This is not this is not a situation where you pick and choose what may or may not be palatable.
Yeah. There's just in the last couple of minutes that we've got to wrap up, I'll ask both of you this question, but there's a great, before I do, there's a great African proverb that says, anyone that thinks they're too small to make a difference hasn't spent the night with a mosquito. So the parting question is, what actions can we take as individuals to reach zero emissions faster? Heidi, I'll kick that one to you, and we'll finish, Zali, with your response to that question as well. So what can we do as individuals, as there are lots of individuals on this call?
I know. Well, this is my favorite one because I'm like, take collective action, folks. Nothing, come on. I feel like this is I know that some people have heard me say that many times before. This is a collective effort. I think that turning up and sharing the conversation tonight, and I know we're going to get to break into groups and continue talking about this with each other after we've stopped talking at you. Work collectively with others. When it comes to your individual impact, there are really important things you can do. To vote, make an informed vote for things that you know matter. So do your research, be informed, and vote for climate. I think the other ones are really about the tricky things, but you can go and get them done in a couple of weeks, and that's shift all of your personal banking and your super into pro-climate funds. Like they sound boring almost, or a bit of a pain to go in and do, but these are foundational things that shift markets, because we talked about capital, trying to find, projects to invest in. That is dollars at work invested in green funds that make this stuff happen. And never think that you don't have enough to make a difference, because you always do. It's that shift and the number of people doing it that triggers more movement in that direction. So individual action, I think, is great, but really for me, the foundation one is work collectively with others. All of our business model at Beyond Zero Emissions is based on a small number of staff working with hundreds of volunteers, really, really smart professionals and academics who come together to do our research and to make these things happen in the world. This is collective action, and this is how you can make a difference. I think, Zali, I'll go to you.
I think we all.
So Zali, other than having more independents that look like Zali, what can individuals do?
No, look, it's very true. To give you an idea, the status quo in Parliament is with 3 more independents or courageous MPs prepared to actually stand up for conviction and cross the floor. We could have a National Integrity Commission, we could have a Climate Change Act, we could do a lot of things. So your number one most powerful action everyone can do is your vote, ultimately, because that does determine policy. Number two, I would say look at your energy. If you have panels, great. If you don't, can you look at moving to renewables in how you're sourcing your energy? It's incredibly effective. Three, move your money. Absolutely agree. Money absolutely is driving the transition and makes a huge difference. And four, it is about be involved, be in the conversation, talk to family, talk to friends, talk to business, look at your employers. What are your employers' policy? The number one advice I've been given around entering into with COP26 is the amount of pressure, and Giles, you touched on it, the amount of pressure in the private sector on their ESG policies. And that is huge, and that is driving and pressuring government at every turn. So that is the best complement to your individual action in relation to your vote.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Zali and Heidi. And to leave you with one additional quote from David Brower: we do not inherit this world from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. And obviously the discussion tonight is very future focused, very forward looking, and you know, really great calls to action there, and really meaningful, workable calls to action from Zali and Heidi. So thank you very much. I'm going to pass it over to Trin. Sorry, I'm late, Trin, but we'll hand it back to you.
No problem. That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Giles, Zali and Heidi. I'm Trin Barter, and on behalf of Susie, Liz and Johnny, I would like to thank all of you for joining us this evening. It was such an interesting and thought-provoking discussion. And Giles, thank you very much for doing such a fabulous job of guiding us tonight. And Heidi and Zali, thank you for sharing your knowledge and for working so hard to ensure that climate change is at the top of the agenda politically and economically. It has been a pleasure to hear from you both. And thank you to all of our attendees. We really appreciate you showing up tonight. I'm sure most of you are sick of Zooms, but that's the only way we can get together at the moment. And we have three important details to let you know about. Firstly, after every conversation, we love to leave you with the resources page, which will be up on our website. And just to run through it really quickly, there's the link to Beyond Zero Emissions, which Heidi is the CEO, links to the Climate Change Bills report and actions. And if you click into that, it gives you a link to writing to your MP, which obviously for us is Trent Zimmerman. And if there are any others, please also feel free to write to Trent, who responded to that report, but also to Scott Morrison, Angus Taylor. There are links to all three. We talked about thinking about your vote. So Zali did inform me actually, I hadn't heard of this before. It's called Vote Earth Now. And it's not about pushing people to vote for the Greens or an independent. It's literally a pledge that simply shows politicians from all parties that climate is the #1 issue for voters across the political spectrum. And clearly all parties do need to move forward if we are to have any hope of mitigating the climate crisis. So thank you for that tip. And then some other wonderful places to look for information are the Climate Council and Climate Works. We've talked about climate change numerous times, which is a great organisation where you can train to become a facilitator, to learn how to have a conversation about climate with your friends and families and neighbours. And they have an event coming up actually that's on this page. We also talked about divesting from fossil fuels. Market Forces is a wonderful organisation that can sort of guide you through that process. They also encourage people to, if you're a bit like me and inherited shares from my grandmother that I'm not particularly proud of today, you can actually pass them over and to Market Forces, and then collectively they use those shares to actually be a voice at AGMs that will basically help them to have impact inside a company. So that's also one thing that's worth looking at. Also, actually that's it. So that's Climate Works at the end. So please take a look at that. And Secondly, Susie will provide a link in the chat now to a survey that we would appreciate if you wouldn't mind filling in, so that we can have feedback to see how we can improve our evenings, or even come to please let us know topic suggestions that you would like to hear about. And thirdly, our next event, we will be inviting Sam Mostyn, Min Long, in conversation with our local journalist, Catherine Fox, to discuss gender equality and discrimination. So that's in 3 weeks' time on Wednesday, the 6th of October. So please save the date for that. Finally, thank you, everybody. We really appreciate you coming, and we'll now be turning to chat roulette, where Susie will randomly allocate us into rooms of 4 people, just to have a short conversation with each other, and to talk about the evening, and hopefully to make a few connections. But I would like you just to say a few final words. Zali, Heidi, Giles. Heidi, would you like to start?
Always with so much to say, but less and less so the closer it gets to midnight. It's been so special to share tonight with you all. I trust that we've inspired and excited you to go and check something out that you haven't tried before, and give it a go. Find a new way to get involved and make a difference. It's been such a pleasure having you here and seeing this really exciting chat going at the same time as listening to Zali and Giles and the great work of the North Sydney Conversations Group. Such a pleasure.
Well, if I could echo that, thank you so much for having me. I think, you know, it's each and every one of us that can make a difference. And I strongly believe that. The climate bills are not over. They will be represented to Parliament in October, and I will be pushing it to a vote at the earliest opportunity, because I feel strongly that we know we're heading into an election in the next 4 to 6 months, and every electorate should know how their MP voted on important legislation. And obviously it's legislation that I'll be taking again to the next election if we can't pass it before that. And I think that's really, really important that we have that clear plan ahead. And so stay informed, everyone. Keep passionate.
Thank you. Giles, thank you.
Thank you very much. And yeah, similar to Heidi and Zali, there's lots of changes we can make, you know, at home with our finances, with our super. Yeah, and to borrow that great slogan from another company, just do it.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody.